The flashlight beam hit her stomach before it reached her face. Denise Calloway sat frozen behind the wheel of her 12-year-old Honda Accord, both hands raised to the top of the steering wheel, exactly the way her father had taught her when she was 16. And she felt the baby shift hard against her ribs as if it too understood that something in this moment had already gone wrong. The officer outside her window had not asked for her license yet. He had not explained why he pulled her over on a stretch of Highway 411 with no other cars in sight. He simply stood there, one hand resting on his belt, studying her face the way a man studies something he has already decided he does not like. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle," he said, and his voice carried the flat, rehearsed calm of someone who had said those exact words 100 times before to 100 different people who looked like her. Denise did not move right away. She glanced down at her belly, 8 months round beneath her seatbelt, and back up at him. "Officer, I am 34 weeks pregnant," she said quietly. "Can you tell me what this stop is regarding?" He did not answer the question. He repeated the instruction, slower this time, the kind of slow reserved for people he had already decided were either lying or stalling. Somewhere behind her sunglasses, Denise began counting, not sheep, violations. The badge on his chest read Wexler, and underneath it a 5-digit number she made herself memorize twice before he could see her eyes move. County plates on his cruiser marked him as Colton County Sheriff's Department, a jurisdiction she had passed through maybe 4 times in her entire life. Always on her way somewhere else, always without incident. This was not somewhere else. This was 7 miles from her mother's front porch, on a road she had driven 1,000 times since she was a teenager learning stick shift in an empty church parking lot 2 miles up. She had not been swerving. She had not been speeding. The only thing she had done, as far as she could tell, was slow down to read a road sign because her phone's GPS had failed her twice already that morning, and slowing down, apparently, had been enough. License and registration, Wexler said, though he still had not told her why he had stopped her, and when she reached slowly toward the glove compartment, her movements careful and deliberate the way every black parent in America teaches their child to move in front of a badge. He took 1 step back and rested his palm flat on the grip of his holster. "Whoa, slow hands," he said. And something in his tone had shifted from bored to alert, as if her simply reaching for the documents he had just asked for was itself the violation. Denise stopped. She kept her hands where he could see them, fingers spread against the dashboard, and she said evenly, without a trace of the fear now climbing up the back of her throat, "I am reaching for my registration. It is in the glove box. I am not going to move quickly, I promise you that." He did not apologize for the reaction. He did not soften. He simply said, "Step out of the car." Now, and this time there was no ma'am attached to it at all. She stepped out onto the gravel shoulder, one hand instinctively cradling the underside of her belly, the August heat pressing down through her blouse like a hand on the back of her neck. 2 more silent seconds passed. Then Wexler said the sentence that would follow Denise Calloway for the rest of her life, the one she would replay in federal testimony 11 weeks later, with her voice steady and her eyes never once leaving his. "I do not care how pregnant you are," he said. "Out here you do exactly what I say when I say it, or this gets a whole lot worse for you." Denise looked at him for a long moment, the sun behind his shoulder turning him into a dark shape she could barely make out. And somewhere in the stillness of that gravel shoulder, she made a decision that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the 12 years of federal courtrooms sitting quietly behind her eyes. She said nothing back. She simply nodded once and kept counting. By the time the second patrol car pulled up, 4 minutes and 11 seconds had passed. Denise knew the exact number because she had started her stopwatch out of habit the second Wexler's lights came on behind her. an old instinct left over from 3 years of prosecuting excessive force cases in federal court. The second officer who climbed out introduced himself as Deputy Roy Hutchins, and where Wexler was sharp edges and short patience, Hutchins had the loose, easy posture of a man who had been friends with his partner for a very long time. "Got a live one," Wexler called out to him, not lowering his voice at all, not caring that Denise stood 8 feet away and heard every word. Refused to hand over her documents right away. Kept stalling. Denise felt her jaw tighten, but she did not correct him. She had learned a long time ago that correcting a man like Wexler in front of an audience only gave him more reason to escalate. So she stood quietly on the shoulder, both hands still visible, and watched a small crowd begin to gather. A produce truck had slowed on the opposite shoulder, the driver leaning out his window with his phone already raised. A woman walking her dog stopped 20 yards up the road and stood very still, the leash slack in her hand. This was the part of the story Denise would later describe to federal investigators as the moment cruelty stopped being private and became a performance. The exact instant when Wexler's behavior shifted from aggressive to theatrical, as if an audience was the only ingredient he had been missing. "Get on your knees," Wexler said, and for the first time that morning something in Denise's calm nearly cracked. "I am 8 months pregnant," she said, her voice rising just slightly, just enough to carry to the produce truck driver still filming across the road. "I cannot get down on gravel. Please, that is a medical reality, not defiance." Hutchins shifted his weight and glanced sideways at his partner. The first small crack of doubt Denise would notice in either man that day. But Wexler did not blink. "On your knees, or I put you down there myself," he said, and reached for the cuffs at his belt. What happened next took 11 seconds, according to the dash camera footage that would later be entered into evidence under seal, then unsealed 9 months after that. Under a federal court order neither Wexler nor his attorney could block. Denise lowered herself as far as her body allowed, one knee touching gravel, her free hand braced against the hot metal of her own car door. And Wexler grabbed her wrist and pulled it behind her back with enough force that she cried out, a short, sharp sound that silenced the small crowd across the road completely. The produce truck driver stopped filming for a second, lowered his phone, said something to himself that the microphone caught only as a muttered, "God Almighty," then raised it again. Hutchins stepped forward and said, quietly, near his partner's shoulder, "Wex, she is pregnant, man. Maybe we ease up." And Wexler's answer, delivered without turning his head, was the second sentence that would end his 11-year career. "She should have thought about that before she gave me attitude," he said, and clicked the second cuff shut. They did not call an ambulance. They did not ask if she felt any pain beyond the obvious discomfort of standing handcuffed on a gravel shoulder in 94-degree heat. They walked her slowly toward the back of Wexler's cruiser, and it was there, with her hand braced against the roof of the car and her breath coming shorter than she wanted anyone to notice, that Denise Calloway said the only thing she would say to either officer for the remainder of the encounter. "You are making a decision right now that you cannot take back once it is made," she said, quiet enough that only Wexler heard it. And he laughed, an actual laugh, short and dismissive, before folding her into the back seat with one hand pressed flat against the top of her head like she was any other body he had loaded into that car 100 times before. "Save the lecture for your lawyer," he said, and shut the door. The ride to the Colton County substation took 19 minutes, and Denise spent every one of them doing the only thing that had ever steadied her under pressure, which was thinking in evidence. She noted the odometer reading on the dash when they pulled out, visible through the plexiglass divider. She noted that Wexler never once radioed in the stop before making the arrest. a violation of protocol so basic that even a rookie 6 weeks out of the academy would know better. She noted, with the particular clarity that comes from having spent a career studying exactly this kind of failure, that nobody in that car had read her a single word of her rights. By the time they walked her through the intake door at the substation, cuffs still on, blouse damp through with sweat, Denise Calloway had already built, in her head, the first 4 pages of the complaint that would eventually carry her name into a federal courtroom, though she did not yet know it would be filed on her behalf rather than by her. The intake officer at the front desk was a younger deputy named Marissa Pratt, no older than 26, and it was Pratt who would later tell federal investigators that something about the arrest paperwork Wexler slid across the counter did not sit right with her from the first glance. The charge listed was obstruction of a lawful order, a catch-all charge Pratt had seen Wexler use before, 3 times in the past year alone. Always against drivers who happened to share one particular thing in common, though she had never let herself say the word out loud until she was under oath. Pratt asked Denise to empty her pockets and her purse onto the counter for processing. A standard procedure, nothing more. And it was there, under the fluorescent lights of a substation lobby that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, that the first crack in Wexler's version of events appeared. Denise's wallet held her driver's license, a grocery store rewards card, $43 in cash, and a slim leather credential holder that Pratt did not recognize at first glance because she had genuinely never seen one outside of a training video. Pratt opened it out of procedural habit, expecting a work badge or an insurance card, and instead found a federal identification card bearing the seal of the United States Department of Justice, the name Denise R. Calloway printed beneath a small photograph, and beneath that, in plain block letters, the title Assistant United States Attorney, Civil Rights Division. Pratt did not say anything for a full 3 seconds, long enough that Denise, still cuffed, still standing, noticed the silence and understood exactly what had just happened without needing to see the card herself. Behind the counter, Wexler was filling out the last line of his report and had not looked up yet. Pratt cleared her throat once, quietly, and said, "Without any theater at all, ma'am, is this current?" Denise met her eyes and said only, "Yes, it is. You are welcome to call the number on the back and verify it right now if you would like." Wexler looked up at that, his pen stopping mid-signature, and for the first time all morning, something crossed his face that was not confidence. Denise watched it happen with the same detached clarity she had used to count violations on the roadside, filing away the exact expression for later, the way a prosecutor files away a witness who has just realized mid-testimony that he has already said too much. "What is that?" Wexler said, and Pratt, to her credit, the same credit that would later earn her a formal commendation from the very department she was about to embarrass, held the credential holder up just far enough for him to see it clearly. "It is a federal prosecutor's identification," Deputy Pratt said. "Civil Rights Division. She has been asking you the same question for the last hour and a half. What is this stop regarding?" Wexler's answer, when it came, was the third and final sentence that federal prosecutors would later read aloud to a grand jury with no embellishment required at all. "That does not change anything," he said. "Dr. Lawyer, whatever she is, out here she is just another driver who gave me attitude. And I do not answer to badges from Washington." He said it loudly enough that 3 other deputies in the bullpen behind him looked up from their desks. And it was that sentence, more than the handcuffs, more than the gravel, more than the 11 seconds of dash camera footage, that federal investigators would later describe as the single clearest piece of evidence in the entire case, because it proved something no witness statement ever could. It proved that even after learning exactly who he had arrested, Wexler had made a conscious, deliberate choice to continue anyway. Denise was permitted one phone call 40 minutes later, after the cuffs came off, and after a watch commander named Lieutenant Farris arrived from a floor she had not known existed, visibly uncomfortable, asking her twice if she needed medical attention. She said she was fine, though her wrist had already begun to bruise in a pattern that would later be photographed and entered into evidence, and she asked for a phone. She did not call a lawyer because she did not need one yet. She called a direct line she had memorized 11 years earlier during her first week at the Department of Justice, a line that rang through to the office of the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division, a woman named Patricia Odom, who had mentored Denise since her first case out of law school. Denise's voice, when Odom picked up, was even and unhurried, the same voice she had used on that gravel shoulder 2 hours earlier. "Patricia, it is Denise," she said. "I need you to open a pattern or practice investigation into the Colton County Sheriff's Department, effective immediately, and I need every complaint filed against a deputy named Wexler for the past 5 years pulled and preserved under litigation hold before anyone in that building has time to think about deleting a single file." The call lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds. By the end of it, Patricia Odom had already begun typing the subject line of an email that would reach the desk of the United States Attorney for the Northern District before the hour was out. Denise sat in her car in the substation parking lot afterward, engine off, both hands resting on the steering wheel, and let herself feel, for exactly 90 seconds, everything she had refused to feel out on the gravel shoulder. Not rage exactly. Something closer to grief, the particular grief of understanding all over again, in her own body this time, and not just in a case file, what it cost to be treated as a threat before anyone had bothered to ask a single real question. Then she started the car, drove the 7 remaining miles to her mother's porch as originally planned, and told herself the work would begin the following morning, because it always did, and because the alternative, letting this become one more file that quietly disappeared into a drawer somewhere in Colton County, was a version of justice she had spent her entire career refusing to accept. The federal investigation moved faster than Colton County expected, mostly because Colton County had never once imagined the woman on that gravel shoulder would be the one holding the subpoena power. Within 72 hours, agents from the FBI's Civil Rights Squad had arrived at the substation with a preservation order for 5 years of body camera footage, personnel files, and internal affairs complaints, 41 of which, it would turn out, had never been formally investigated at all. 23 of those 41 complaints named Deputy Cody Wexler specifically, and of those 23, 19 involved black drivers pulled over on stretches of road with no witnesses and no independent camera coverage until the department's body camera policy finally caught up to state law 2 years earlier. Sheriff Wade Buford, who had led the department for 14 years and who golfed every second Saturday of the month with a circuit court judge named Elliot Marsh, released a statement within the first week describing Wexler as one of his most dedicated officers, and calling the incident an unfortunate misunderstanding that had been, in his words, blown out of proportion by outside interests unfamiliar with the realities of rural law enforcement. That statement did not age well. 9 days after it was released, investigators uncovered an email chain between Sheriff Buford and Wexler's direct supervisor, Captain Roy Hensley, dated 14 months earlier, in which Hensley had recommended a formal disciplinary review after a separate complaint alleging Wexler had used excessive force during a traffic stop involving a black college student on his way home from a night class. Buford's reply, 3 lines long, read only, "Let it go, Roy. He is a good deputy having a rough patch. Do not put anything on paper that follows him around." That single email, 7 words long at its core, would later be read into the federal record as evidence not just of individual misconduct, but of what investigators termed an institutional pattern of protection. The very definition of the pattern or practice violation Denise had asked her mentor to investigate from a substation parking lot with a bruised wrist and a stillborn baby's heartbeat thudding steady against her palms. Captain Hensley's brother-in-law, as it happened, was County Commissioner Denise Marsh, no relation to Denise Calloway beyond the coincidence of a first name that several local reporters could not resist mentioning. And it was Commissioner Marsh who had quietly steered county funding away from an independent civilian oversight board proposal 3 years earlier, a proposal that, had it passed, would have required exactly the kind of external review that might have caught Wexler's pattern years before a pregnant federal prosecutor ever drove down Highway 411. The web connecting Wexler to Hensley, to Buford, to Marsh, to Judge Elliot Marsh, who had personally dismissed 2 prior civil complaints against the department on procedural technicalities, was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was something far more common and far more damning, the ordinary machinery of a small system quietly protecting its own, one favor and one unwritten email at a time, until the day it protected the wrong person against the wrong woman on the wrong stretch of road. Wexler was indicted 6 weeks later under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law, a federal charge reserved specifically for the abuse of government authority to violate a person's constitutional protections. He was also charged separately under state law for excessive force. His attorney in every public statement insisted that Wexler had simply been doing his job under difficult and ambiguous circumstances, and Wexler himself, even after being shown the full body camera footage during a pretrial hearing, even after hearing his own voice say the words that does not change anything played back to a silent courtroom, refused to express a single word of remorse. Asked directly by a federal magistrate whether he believed, in hindsight, that his conduct on the gravel shoulder that morning had been appropriate, Wexler answered without hesitation. "I followed my training," he said. "I would do the exact same thing again." It was that sentence, delivered under oath with no visible doubt behind it, that convinced the 12 people on his eventual jury more than any single piece of physical evidence that this had never been a rough patch or a misunderstanding at all. Denise testified for 2 hours and 11 minutes, and true to the instinct that had carried her through the entire ordeal, she never once raised her voice. She described the gravel biting into her knee. She described the 11 seconds during which her wrist was pulled behind her back with a force the department's own use of force policy explicitly prohibited for any detainee in a visibly late-stage pregnancy. She described in plain and unadorned language exactly what it felt like to hear a man decide, out loud in front of witnesses, that her body's basic physical limitations were simply an inconvenience to his authority. She did not describe her job title until the prosecution's final questions, and when she did, she said it simply, without weight, because by that point in the trial, the jury already understood exactly what it meant. "I am an assistant United States attorney in the Civil Rights Division," she said. "I have spent 12 years prosecuting the exact kind of conduct that was used against me that morning. I did not tell Deputy Wexler that on the roadside, and I want to be clear about why. I did not tell him because it should never have mattered. The law does not have a different standard for people who carry a badge of their own." The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 19 minutes before returning a guilty verdict on the federal civil rights charge. Wexler was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, a sentence his attorney called excessive, and the presiding judge called, in her own words from the bench, a floor, not a ceiling, given the documented pattern behind it. Captain Hensley resigned 11 days before his own internal affairs hearing was scheduled to begin. Sheriff Buford did not seek re-election the following year, losing what little support remained once the email chain became public record. And Commissioner Denise Marsh stepped down from the county board after a local investigative piece connected her opposition to civilian oversight directly to her brother-in-law's role in burying the earlier complaints. Judge Elliot Marsh was referred to the State Judicial Conduct Commission and voluntarily retired before a formal ruling was issued. A resignation many in the county considered, fairly or not, an admission all its own. None of it, Denise would say later, felt like victory in the way people imagined it should. It felt like exhaustion and relief and a strange, quiet grief for every driver who had been pulled over on that same stretch of road in the 19 years before her, the ones whose names never made it into a federal indictment because they did not happen to be carrying a Department of Justice credential in their wallet. It was that grief, more than any desire for personal vindication, that led Denise to spend the 8 months following the trial working alongside the Department of Justice's Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services on what eventually became a mandatory reform package for Colton County, one that required body cameras to remain active and unedited for the full duration of every traffic stop, established an independent civilian oversight board with actual subpoena power, and mandated specific training protocols for the treatment of visibly pregnant detainees, a provision that state lawmakers, 12 months later, adopted statewide and named, over Denise's own quiet objection, the Callaway Protocol. Deputy Marissa Pratt, the young officer, who had opened that credential holder without hesitation and asked one honest question in a lobby that smelled like burnt coffee, was promoted to sergeant the following spring and later selected to help design the department's new training curriculum on de-escalation and implicit bias, the kind of work that rarely makes headlines, but that Denise considered, when she thought about it honestly, the single most important outcome of the entire ordeal. It was proof of the things she had believed since her very first week of law school, and had simply had reconfirmed for her, at considerable personal cost, on a gravel shoulder off Highway 411. Systems do not change because the people who abuse them suddenly develop a conscience. They change because someone inside that system, even a 26-year-old deputy 3 weeks into the job, decides that one honest question is worth more than the comfort of looking the other way. Denise gave birth to a healthy daughter 11 weeks after the trial concluded, and she named her Odom after the mentor who had answered a 3-minute phone call without a single question of doubt. She went back to work 4 months later, back to the same Civil Rights Division office, back to the same kind of cases that had defined her entire career. Though she noticed, without ever saying so out loud to her colleagues, that she read every new complaint that crossed her desk a little differently now. She no longer had to imagine what it felt like to be the person on the other side of the badge, hands raised, waiting to see whether the person standing over her would choose decency or power. She already knew, and on the mornings when the work felt heaviest, when another file landed on her desk describing another gravel shoulder in another county, she thought about the exact moment on that August morning when she had knelt on hot stone with her daughter pressing hard against her ribs and made the only decision that had ever mattered to her, which was not to fight and not to beg, but simply to keep counting, patiently, precisely, until the day the count would finally matter to someone other than herself. This story is a work of fiction. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are not based on any real individual, department, or case, though the patterns of conduct they portray reflect documented realities studied extensively in civil rights law and law enforcement accountability research across the United States. It is told not to condemn the many officers who serve their communities with integrity every single day, but to honor the quiet, difficult work of the ones who speak up when it would be easier to stay silent, and to remind every viewer that dignity should never depend on a person's title, their income, or the badge they may or may not be carrying in their wallet. If this story moved you, consider learning your own rights during a traffic stop, supporting independent civilian oversight in your community, and remembering that real change rarely comes from the loudest voice in the room. It comes from the ones who keep their composure, keep the receipts, and refuse to let an injustice disappear quietly into a drawer.